Welcome to the Affirming Village podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Welcome back to the Affirming Village podcast, where we talk about neuroaffirming approaches in special education and at the IEP table, centering safety, dignity, and access for our learners.
Because safety isn't just about being physically present in a classroom, it's about how a child is experiencing that environment.
I'm Destiny.
And I'm Lisa.
And today we're having a conversation that can be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. And so we do want to give a trigger warning, as we are going to be talking about seclusion and restraint and how unsafe school environments can impact learners' mental health.
And not just in the ways people usually think about. We're talking about emotional safety, nervous system safety, psychological safety, because a child can be in a classroom all day and still not feel safe.
And when a child doesn't feel safe, we see it in their behavior, in their shutdown, in their school avoidance or need-based school avoidance, or however you want to term that, in their mental health.
But instead of asking, what is making this environment feel unsafe for this young person, we far too often ask, how do we get this child to comply?
Exactly. And that shift in question changes everything.
So today we're going to talk about the signs that a school environment may not be safe, the conversations that are often avoided, and what advocacy can look like when safety is the priority.
Because making it through the day is not the goal. Feeling safe enough to access their education should be.
Exactly. So let's get into this.
So if you've listened to our episodes before this, you know that Lisa and I, one, don't shy away from hard topics. But two, we essentially live and breathe the work that we do. Again, we are neurodivergent individuals. We do have a neurodivergent child or three between us. We, advocate for families of neurodivergent learners. And so this was a topic that felt necessary based on the different things that we've discussed. And as we round out season one, we have a few more episodes as we round the season out. But also, I think just with the current state of special education, where I know as an advocate, I am seeing a lot more disciplinary approaches. I am seeing a lot less understanding in some settings and in some grades and in some states when it comes to dysregulation. But also professional pieces aside, this is a topic that is personal for both of us. For me, as a mental health professional, and I am a certified trauma therapist for children and adolescents, I have worked with children who have experienced trauma for years throughout my professional career. But when my son entered into the public school system, there was a lot of seclusion and restraint. And there was an SRO in his school. And I will say that the SRO in his school was very kind and very caring, and actually did treat my son as a person, and more so would diffuse through conversation and like talking about Pokemon and talking about all these things. And I never knew, but I think he might have had a son. And I think that's where he connected with my son. But before he would come in would be a lot of the seclusion and restraint. Um and here we are 5 years later, and my son has never forgot that. And in fact, during OT last year, private OT, when we were doing interception and doing all those things, um, he actually verbalized that being restrained was the worst thing. It made him more dysregulated, and that he did not like it. And I think there's all this, I feel, theoretical talk, right, about seclusion and restraint a lot of times. Like, it's horrible. Why would you do that? And then you have others that are like, well, it's absolutely done at the absolute moment for the last possible reason for the safety of everyone. Which, by the way, we have actually found through research is not true. It's often used whenever the adult feels unsafe or dysregulated, and then they further dysregulate and cause trauma to the child. But to have a 8-year-old, I want to say at the time of this conversation, say that, you really have to reflect on the impact. To know that autistics and neurodivergence, in my opinion, but I will specifically say autistics in reference to me and my son, can carry things mentally for years. Um, the type of trauma that impact had, it's always something that I don't think gets talked about enough. And so we really wanted to have this episode where we might get emotional, we might cry. We've got our stuff on standby for that. Um, because we don't want to shy away from it. And we think that sometimes it just needs to be said and it needs to be heard that seclusion and restraint causes trauma.
Oh, 150% without any question. And, I've been thinking about this a lot lately because there have been some really horrific and awful stories that have come out, um, where, I do think that the common narrative, in terms of trying to kind of excuse these practices is exactly what you just said. Oh, heavens to Betsy. It's only used when a crisis point has been reached and it's for safety reasons. And that's not true. Um, Seclusion and restraint are used, honestly, you said it well, right? When the adults feel threatened and they become dysregulated, and about asserting power and control and about containment. There's a level of punishment and dehumanization that is happening in that moment. And that's not to say that multiple things can't be true at the same time, right? Like, a piece of that is concern for your own safety. A piece of that is concern for the other learners in the space, their safety, and perhaps even some level of concern for the learner who's dysregulated. But the piece that is really missing from the consideration is what is going to be the long lasting impact of harm for me violating this young person's bodily autonomy and essentially, um, meeting their vulnerability and their dysregulation with violence. And it does, my daughter was restrained twice, as an elementary learner. And she was secluded once, and she was in preschool. She was 3, and it was like a rainy day, and the schedule was like off, and they just didn't know what to do with her. And so they just like kind of put her away essentially. And it wasn't necessarily a result of disciplinary. They just didn't know how to get her to comply with what was going on. And so they just kind of threw her away in a corner and were like, you do you, because we're done with you. And she had minimal speech at the time. She never spoke to anybody unsolicited. And I just remember picking her up and all afternoon, over and over and over and over again. Miss Nati put me timeout. Miss Nati put me timeout. Miss Nati put me timeout. She is 28 years old. She still talks about Miss Nati putting her timeout. Right now, it's a miracle that Miss Nati is still with us, at least to my knowledge. Because I just remember my son had swim lessons that day, and like I obviously took her with me, and she went up to every single person. Miss Nati put me timeout. My husband got home from work. Miss Nati put me. I was like, if I hear Miss Nati put me timeout one more time, I'm gonna put Miss Nati in a damn timeout. But it does. It's incredibly disquieting. It's confusing. She didn't understand. I imagine that your son didn't understand, like, why is somebody violating my personhood? Like it really disrupts those foundations of safety. Um, and I do think the impact of that stays with a young person and can look really different, but it stays with a young person for a really, really, really long time.
Yeah, and you made me think of like I think until you see a dysregulated learner that is your child, for a better lack of words, and I say this as I was that parent. You call me, I'm gonna come. I'm gonna drop everything. And because I want to lay eyes on my child. And so, I know there's a lot of nerves like, oh, if they call you, just don't go. Or I always tell my parents, it's not necessarily about don't go, right? If they call you because you're trying to make them do their job. Because I need to see my kid. I need to lay eyes on my kid. I need to make sure my kid is okay, right?
Right.
But it's also of like a pointing out too, like you're not doing your job, right? So it's a combination of the two. But one of the things was that because I was the parent that always came, I had the ability to see my child dysregulated. And I think until you see what I can only describe as your child seeming like a caged animal, you don't understand the impact that these things have on them.
Right.
And being able to come into that space with my child and he's so dysregulated that I know he doesn't hear me and going, and this is when I did have to, like, I had to grab my son by his arms and say, can you hear me? And for him to like lock eyes with me and
Right.
be like, oh, my mom is here. And then stop and reset. And we just sat there. And until you see that, and you have to be regulated, and you have to regulate, and then your mind is going, what led to this? Because this is my child. I think you don't know the impact that has. And in this particular moment that I'm referring to, he was 6 and his one-to-one had changed. And we'd been having a amazing year. And actually was 7. We've been having an amazing year. And the one-to-one, they thought because he was doing great, they put him with someone new, like fresh, like never done this before. And thankfully we had it. We'd been at the school already a year. We had an amazing team. And so the special education teacher and the gen ed teacher were like, this is not the right staff for him. They said
Right.
that. And so we were all on the same page. And in fact, before I even laid eyes on my child, the assistant principal had pulled me into the office and was like, we have changed his one-to-one. like we've assigned someone else, because we did have that relationship and we had built that and we'd had that communication, and they'd seen the growth and they've seen all these wonderful things and they've seen what can happen with the right support. And a lot of families don't get that. And we had actually gotten that. And so because of that, it was like a clearly the issue is not the learner. And it shouldn't again be like that. I want to be clear. But it was a situation where they were like the issue's not the learner, the issue's not the parents. The issue is something here in the environment or the person that we're providing for this learner. But again, having seen all that growth and that progress and seeing what was capable in the setting, right? Because kindergarten was a shit show.
Right.
And this is a new school and a new environment. And again, I always say, in case you're listening to this for the first time, you just heard this podcast, this teacher was amazing. That was not our issue. But it's one of those things where until you experience that, you know, you just have two sides, I feel like, of the coin of like you have the fear of like, I don't want that to happen to my child. I don't think that should happen to a child. And then you have the, but I've seen situations where it's justified and you don't understand it's a safety issue and it's this and that. And you have to think outside of even that, because situations like that don't have to be justified if we're proactive. Situations like that don't have to occur if we listen to the parent, if we listen to the concerns, if we listen to the educator. I've had educators who are like, this learner needs these things, but because I'm the only one seeing it in my classroom, nobody else in the school is willing to provide the support or offer the suggestion to the parents or do XYZ. And so I think it's just a different thing when you have experienced it and you have lived through it. And it's a real possibility. It's a real fear because you've experienced it.
Right.
And I think it sets up a different dynamic again for people that are just like, that's a horrible thing, you should never do it. And there's times when you have to do it, and the other people who have lived it. It's very different.
No, it's really different. I'm thinking of a family I worked with. Well, I started working with a long time ago and have kind of come in and out. I'm currently in an inn, which is wonderful because I love them, but the reasons aren't wonderful. But when I was brought in, their learner was in a program that practiced seclusion and restraint on the daily. And they'd had meeting after meeting after meeting to say, please do not touch our child. If they reach a point of dysregulation where you feel they are unsafe or you are unsafe, you need to contact us immediately and we will get to the campus immediately. Please do not call the police. And the next day they called the police. And things went very sideways, and I will skip the details for confidentiality reasons, but the trauma that it cost this young person and their family, they're still paying the price, but I'm talking about like really intense traumatic experiences that resulted from those phone calls. It wasn't the first time they'd called the police, but their decisions harmed this child in ways that will probably span the lifespan. Not just for this young person, but for their parents. And like I said, I've kind of supported them, and then things have settled a little, and so I've stepped out and kind of in and out type thing. And so I've been out for however many months, and now I'm back in, and the parents are just like, for as collaborative as we like to be, they're feeling like maybe we needed to take a harder line, maybe it's our fault. And I'm like, it's not your fault. But they're showing up really differently in this advocacy moment, because it's like, I know what happens when I let y'all kind of lead this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we're not playing. And the district, I will say, is stuck on fucking stupid to the point where I'm like ready to pluck my eyelashes out one at a time. But they're kind of digging themselves their own grave, so there's that. But you're absolutely right. Like, I could turn the temperature down a little bit and just pull it back to give us all a little bit of a breather to just nervous system safety in general. Destiny, you had me come to your summit. I'm like, what month is it? It's April. So a few weeks ago, it was in March, to talk about nervous system safety and how to support nervous system safety in the school setting. And, the way I kind of conceptualized it and was able to talk about it was to sort of look at how I define that, right? Like, and it really is the learner's sense of felt safety and
Mm-hmm.
regulation, right? So it's the learner's experience. It grounds them in, um, like, our decision making process, of how to support them instead of whatever the adults think is safe or okay. It's how is this learner experiencing this environment? And then I kind of broke it down into, like, what are those barriers to access for kind of higher masking learners? And what
Mm-hmm.
are some of the assumptions that the adults make about higher masking learners? What are some of the barriers to access for learners that have more of that fight flight stress response? And what are
Mm-hmm.
the assumptions that are being made about those young people? And then non-speakers, which obviously non-speakers have a vast, um, diversity in terms of nervous system response, right? But I do think those barriers to access in terms of communication really inform one's sense of felt safety in any given space.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so really sort of looking at what the barriers are there and what the assumptions that are made about non-speakers, and how that impacts, um, their access to felt nervous system safety, right? And so I think that these conversations can be tricky to have with teams depending on the learner, because in the case of like higher masking learners, there's an assumption that they're fine, they'll access help when they need it, all's good, they're, whatever. That's often not the experience of the young person. They're often really overwhelmed and driving for perfection and really afraid of getting in trouble or doing something wrong, and right, like all those things. In the case of a learner who's more externalized in their stress response, they are particularly vulnerable to seclusion and restraint and these more violent practices because they're perceived as dangerous, right? And they're dehumanized really quickly. Um, and I think the same thing happens for non-speakers. I think there's this really well-meaning, expression that honestly makes me want to put my head through a wall, which is all, behavior is communication. And whenever I hear somebody say that, I'm like, oh, you've spent zero time listening to the non-speaking population. Thank you so much for, like, tell me you don't listen to non-speakers without telling me you don't listen to non-speakers, right? That we're not really understanding, motor differences and inhibition, and right, like we don't understand, um, that brain body disconnect, right? We don't understand, so we misinterpret some of what happens for somebody who's living in an apraxic body as quote unquote violent or dangerous, and then we step in with these barbaric practices and cause real harm. And so, it's, really important to be nuanced in how we're thinking about these things, um, how we're asking these questions, and how we're really grounding the learner's perspective, um, in that process.
Absolutely. And I think too, when we're talking about nervous system safety and felt safety and psychological safety and cueing safety, when we're looking at the different populations and we're looking at, non-speakers, and also the other side of that is pushing that elephant into the room that I often have to bring up as Black and brown learners,
Oh, 100%.
and the bias and prejudice, the adultification of the learners. And so this perception of, and when someone's listening to this going, oh my gosh, no one, yes,
Yes.
the perception of Black and brown learners, Black and brown individuals being more inherently violent or aggressive or unsafe. And I think, as we have found again with, like the civil rights data that was released, I think it was 2024, Black and brown learners are more likely to be secluded and restrained. They're more likely to be put out of schools. They're more likely to be suspended and expelled. And that all has a psychological impact as well. And in my son's case, he was in a predominantly white school. And I will say that there was a lot of ableism, and then there was also a hint of racism.
Oh, 100%.
And I think too, I know it's just, Lisa and I talking in conversations, like, we advocate on a fairly consistent basis for Black and brown learners that are seen as a threat at 4 and 5 years old. And the learner that I referenced in a previous episode that we recorded that is doing incredibly well right now and thriving, which makes me so happy, is a little guy. He was being just labeled as this threat at 4 and 5 years old. And so I think part of two cueing that safety is checking bias and prejudice. It's checking how you're viewing this learner. It's identifying how you're showing up. And it's also checking with your own regulation. And I think something we don't talk about enough is that a lot of times, and you can put this in any context, I feel, outside of school, in school, in homes, and office spaces, and whatever, that sometimes traumatized people traumatize people. And I say that in the sense of, I've often found where there is a lack of safety and regulation is often because there's a lot of dysregulation in the adult themselves. And so they're entering into a space and they're cueing dysregulation. And it's heightening everything around. And what happens is we get into those things we talk about where the learner is like, I don't want to go to school, or they don't want to access a certain class, or they don't want to go to a certain special. And when I say specials, I'm talking about like music, art, PE, things like that. But they're not wanting to access something, or they're struggling to access something, and they have the inability to communicate it because even if they don't have the language, right? And so that's the thing we also don't do well with, I think, as adults, is that modeling and that teaching. And so you could have a non-speaking learner that doesn't even have access to communicate certain words because they've never been given those words. And then you'll have a learner who uses mouth words, right? That doesn't have the ability to say, I'm uncomfortable, I don't feel safe. And so in turn, it comes in the form of shutting down. It comes in the form of physiological symptoms that we associate with anxiety, of being nauseous, inability to access school. Like, it comes in all these waves. It comes in behavior that's dysregulation and, very external. It comes in all these waves because the adults are not regulated, but also not modeling and giving the language to communicate. and then subsequently validating. I think that's another layer to it, right? It can't just be because there's a lot of learners will say, I need help. I can't do this. I don't like this. I don't want to go in there. I don't want to. And instead of validating that, instead of helping them get regulated, it's like, no, you can do it. It's fine. It'll be okay. And that in turn is dismissive. And it's not pushing the resilience narrative, I think, that is often put out there of like teaching that resiliency,
Right.
teaching through. It is teaching them to ignore their own body cues, and it is teaching them to ignore their own nervous system. And then subsequently, we have adults that don't know if they do feel safe or not because they spent their whole life being invalidated and gaslit.
Oh my God. You just said a word right there. No, it's so true. Like, it's so true because we put so much value, whether we're conscious of it or not, on the pushing through, doing the thing, building resiliency, that we don't realize the backside of that is building distrust of self,
Mm-hmm.
ignoring your own cues of like, this doesn't feel right, right? We ignore learners' self advocacy all the time. And then when they advocate for themselves in a way that's bigger, louder, larger, right? That we don't like, well, then they're a behavior problem, right? I want to go back to something that you were saying earlier in terms of Black and Brown learners, um, you know, absolutely being discriminated against, absolutely, bias, assuming they're more violent, the adultification, all the things. And also acknowledge that there's bias when their Black mothers show up angry,
Mm-hmm.
that we don't listen to the very legitimate concerns of their mothers because we have a bias about the quote unquote angry Black woman. And
Mm-hmm.
so we delegitimize the advocacy of the parent that is showing up saying, my learner is not safe. You are not seeing them as a whole person. Like, absolutely the fuck not. No, because, oh, she's just angry and she's whatever, and we don't have to listen to her. And I think that's an important piece to name as part of that cycle of violence that does happen. And like you're saying, sometimes we get folks that are like, no, that would never. I am telling you right now, unfortunately, yes, it does. I
Mm-hmm.
wish it didn't with my whole soul, but
Mm-hmm.
it does over and over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, and I have families that come to me and they say just that. I don't want to
Mhm,
be the angry Black mother.
mhm.
And so I need someone that is level headed, that can be in the room, that can, pull the conversation back in. And I mean, I think my husband, he says it best. He's like, I cannot, with my 5'10", built like a football player, Black frame. He's like, I can't react and respond the way some others do. I will get arrested, you know?
Mhm.
And that's hard when it's your child.
Right, and you're pissed.
When you're right. Like it's so
That too.
like, you're stepping in
Right.
face and you're like, I legitimately know what I'm saying is valid, but I have to be very like calm and cool and collected. And that speaks to, again, the child themselves, where we're actively having conversations as well with our sons that are getting older. That like you have to demonstrate a certain level of regulation. There's certain things that are not gonna fly.
Right.
And it's not neuroaffirming, but it's life saving. And it's the conversations that have to happen. And I think that's part of the work. I'm very passionate about the work, and I'm very passionate about constantly, constantly, constantly talking about behavior.
Right.
Is because I want to reshape that narrative, because I want to prevent that trauma. And I think that another thing we're getting at when you talk about that mental health piece and being safe is a lot of learners step into the school space with weight already on their shoulders. And that could be weight from things others have said. That could be weight from prior experiences, right? Because just because you weren't there during their kindergarten year and they're now in fourth grade,
right,
doesn't mean that that has left them, that that setting, that environment, the tone, the approach, the language. And so I know someone's listening to this going, okay, well, Destiny, what the fuck do I do about that? You know, right? Like, how do I know you're thinking it. And I just know you are, because I would be like that. Like, I'd be like, okay, like I didn't do it though. So what do I do? And I will say one of the things on the parent side that I've done when it comes to that is that when I request an IEP meeting at the beginning of every school year with my child's IEP team. I want to see all the general education teachers. I want to make sure they understand the IEP. I want to make sure that they understand what's in it. I want them to be able to ask questions. And I have all my clients subsequently do this. So all my clients do this now too. And I tell them about all those years ago. Mm-hmm. I tell them what we went through. And I tell them that because I tell them we will not be going back.
Right.
And I opened that door because I know someone's listening to this going, oh my gosh, if a parent showed them, let me finish. I tell them that to open the door to say, if there's an issue, talk to me. Talk to dad. We will problem solve with you.
Right.
We will work together with you. And I have seen where that has made them comfortable.
Right.
That when I do send an email with my son's perspective of situations and things that we've talked through, that they take that as us working together as a team. Right. And not, she's trying to tell us how to do our job. She's trying to tell us we did something wrong. She's trying to, they understand the collaborative nature. So that's something I recommend for my parents. For my school staff, see, my mother and sister are educators. My sister is actively a second grade teacher. And one of the things her and I are always talking about is that reframe after the situation, that reframe when you're regulated. And one of the things that she has often been able to do in that regard is then subsequently acknowledge, I handled this situation this way because I was dysregulated. Should that situation come up again, this is how I would like to handle it. What do I need to do that? Right. And so it's really about that reflection and recognizing what you need to feel regulated and what you can provide for them to be regulated.
Right.
And that, and sometimes even again, and I've said this in previous episodes, just that validation is enough. My son's one-to-one said he realized one day when he just told him, you know what? Yeah, this is stupid. And he was like, you know, and he said, my son instantly was just like, you get it. And then he did the thing because it was acknowledged. He acknowledged that what he was feeling. He gave an example of his own about something that he felt was the same way. And it was paying car insurance on a car you own, which I agree. And he was like, but unfortunately, I have to do it. You know, right. This was a task that was a test that, you know, my son did have to do at some point in life. And having built that relationship with him, he was like, he already knew, like, you're not going to want to do this later, dude. Like, he's like, so can we do it now? And my son did it and it was fine. But it's that validation and that sharing, right? Which is building that connection, which lets it be known that this is safe and I can have these discussions. And so when we talk about the mental health piece and the safety piece, you know, it really does get into that connection and being regulated and that validation. And I'm not saying that all those layers do not make it difficult when you have 20, 30 kids. What I am saying is that there's a difference between showing up, making the effort, and giving a shit, and just being like, oh, that's too much, and not, and then you subsequently see the result of that.
Right, right. I think that I don't know the right words. I often find myself like wondering where common sense has gone. Right. But I do feel like folks feel pressure, right? School teams feel pressure. There's so much to get through, and I only have so little time, and I got to get through this curriculum, and I got to keep the class managed, and I've got to, right? You know, if you're a paraprofessional, like I'm supposed to keep this kid in line, or what, right? Like whatever the messaging has been, that
Mm-hmm.
we lose sight of exactly what your son's para did, which is, oh man, all right, this sucks. Like, how are we gonna get through this? Right? Do we want to like bite the bullet and do it now? And it's funny. I'm thinking of a girlfriend of mine who has a learner that the school's being ridiculous about para support, blah blah. But we live in a university town, and there's like volunteers from the university that come in and whatever. And oh, let's all sit down for this shocking news that her child does much better when the volunteer from the university is there in the classroom. And I told my friend, I was like, my guess is that I'm going to say kid, but all college students. What is this person? You know, somewhere between, it's an upper division class, so probably between ages of like 20 and maybe 22, is coming in and going, "Oh man, I hated this when we had to do it. Like, what math are we doing?" Right? Where they're cueing safety through humor, they're cueing safety through kind of that team language, like, "Oh, what the shit are we doing today?" Right? Like, right? Like they're bringing an energy of like, "Oh, what cockamamie-ness have we got going on here?" Instead of that top down, I have to control you, I'm here to like contain you because you apparently are out of line. It's like, did you hear what the teacher said? Oh shit, I missed what the teacher said. Maybe should we ask somebody what the teacher, what are we supposed to be doing right now? Right? Like where you can bring some levity into the situation, be a human connecting with another human, right? Like I just feel like there's times where it's like, yes, the IEP needs to be followed and it needs to be implemented with fidelity and like all the things, but there's a human element of like, show up as your authentic self, have some freaking humor and some levity, show up with joy for this young person, right? Like, that's going to take you so much farther than on page 3 of your BIP. It says, right, like, yes, follow the behavior intervention plan, but like, show up as a person, right? Like, I feel like that piece is missing.
No, but you go back to something fundamentally that we talk about a lot, which is that children are people.
Right.
People. And I think one of the things that we have touched on in another episode is just that mental health, just in the United States where we're located, is just not taken seriously enough. And I think other
Right.
countries have expressed the same. And that's part of the problem, is that it's not. And so, we don't do well with mental health for anyone. Not our school staff, and definitely not our learners. And I think the big piece for us of this episode was to just get out there to say it, and it's been said in many ways. The Alliance Against Restraint and Seclusion with Guy Stevens, amazing nonprofit, has a podcast, and basically they spend all the episodes diving into the research side of seclusion restraint and rewards and incentives and how they're ineffective, and how we're harming learners. And that comes from Guy's background of why he started that nonprofit and the trauma there. So I definitely want to give a shout out to that, and all the amazing work that they're doing. But we wanted to give that professional, personal side of the impact and the importance of seeing outside of yourself. Going back to that original statement of there is this perception and narrative for a lot of school staff that this is absolutely that seclusion and restraint are absolutely used in a certain manner for only certain reasons, which research has showed is not true. There's a disconnect between understanding how a learner not accessing the setting, not being able to do the task, not being able to show up has come from build up over time. It's often perceived as just this, oh my gosh, this just happened. Um, where parents are like, no, this has been headed in this direction. And I have a family I'm supporting right now where that is the case before they brought me on and before, just without getting into like, Lisa said that confidentiality piece, they had been essentially saying for about year, 2 years, we're going to be headed in this direction because the learner was internalizing in the school setting, externalizing at home. Now it has bled into the school setting. And now all of a sudden, let's do all these proactive things, which are reactive. They're not proactive because it's already
Right,
happened.
100%.
And so it's just really, you have to think about, as my husband would say, the second, third, and fourth order effects. And when we talk about mental health, when we talk about safety, um, that is what we're asking you to do, is to consider what is the impact of this action, of this setting on the learner, and what happens when they are not safe. And I know right now you can find several parents in every state who their learner is not accessing brick or mortar, if they're accessing education at all, from that mental health piece.
Yeah. I'm in my head debating how dark to take the conversation. I think what can happen, and I hear this happen, I just had this threatened a couple weeks ago with a young person, is that dehumanization piece.
Mm-hmm.
That they're too much, they're not safe, um, they need to be removed, they need to be placed in a more restrictive setting. Um, and I don't want to paint with a broad stroke, and I certainly don't want to frighten anyone. But restraint can be deadly. And there are certain settings where it is used more often. It's not just in an emergency situation, it becomes common practice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the learners are dehumanized. Um, and it can have a deadly outcome. Um, and unfortunately, I got to witness this firsthand with a dear friend's son. The trauma isn't just for the family. It impacts anybody that knew that person, who has a learner that matches that kind of disability profile. It's very, very scary. It certainly informs my work. I'm a pretty flexible person, but not on this issue. And I have certainly stopped teams dead in their tracks when they have tried to suggest this is a practice that needs to be implemented to control a learner. Where I'm just like, not on my watch. We will not be doing this. But part of the experience of losing Max, where there were people that were like, well, what are you supposed to do when a child is being violent? Which is so the wrong goddamn question. Um, First of all, in his particular case, he wasn't at all. He spit, and they decided that was enough of a transgression to put him in a prone restraint, a prolonged prone restraint. Um, but there was a culture in that environment of dehumanizing these young people, and they weren't considering their humanity at all. They weren't considering their families. They weren't considering the consequences of their actions. And obviously, the most catastrophic outcome happened for Max, but every single learner in that building had been secluded and restrained on repeat. I have subsequently worked with families who, just by happenstance, their learners were placed in that program, which is now shut down. Um, and they're still dealing with the consequences. And I think that in our previous episode, we were talking about accommodations and how kind of access to accommodations can vary by setting from setting to setting. I think the practice of seclusion and restraint, the level of dehumanization, actually varies from placement to placement along that continuum of what's the word I'm going for? uh, the full continuum of placements. I'm like having a brain fart. Um, and as we move towards more restriction, more restrictive environments, we see more violence in practice. There's actually less oversight in the non-public and residential worlds. Those kinds of practices are seen as necessary, and it's always written on the books as last resort. Um, but in practice, that is often not what is happening. And it's terrifying to me that it occurs in any setting. But the fact that it happens in the shadows where there's less oversight um, is really, really concerning. So I know I just took us right to the darkest place and the scariest place. But we can't have this episode and me not name that very real experience. It happens.
Absolutely. And I think the other side, as we've stepped into the dark side, right? The other side is that for those learners that internalize and don't externalize,
Mm-hmm.
and you get self harm, you get ideations,
Mm-hmm.
um, you get elopements from home, elopements from school to places. Um, and I want to be clear, not all elopements are I'm running away because I'm overstimulated, I'm over frustrated, I'm overwhelmed. I've seen where the elopement it was because the library is right there, and the learner is like, I want to go to the library, and I'm minimally speaking, and nobody will take me to the library, even though I've gestured several times I want to go to the library, right? And but you get those things, and I will say, with disclosure, as a late diagnosed autistic individual, I was an internalizer, and I will leave that there. But I was an internalizer. And so I understand as a professional and a mental health professional, but also as a person. And the mental health matters. And the
Yeah.
safety matters. And creating that matters. And I, luckily, as all of my families I support do, had great parents that were supportive in creating that environment. And I think that also has to be taken into consideration a little more too on the school side of the parents' mental health
Yeah.
and trying to protect their own child's mental health and the impact of that. And I say that because as we are in this space and we are talking and we talk about IEPs and special education, um, I often will see where a learner is considered a behavior problem or a learner is considered quote unquote fine. And the impact falls on the learner and the parent to resolve the situation.
Right.
And that's not fair, but also not their job. And so it's important that we have more honest conversation about school settings being dysregulating because the adults are dysregulated, so that we can actually create supports and systems that allow for regulation for everyone.
Absolutely.
When I step into IEP meetings, one of the things I always mention is that by supporting the learner, you are supporting their peers and supporting yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what happens, and I didn't notice when we started recording, but I'm sure that we're probably close to needing to wrap up. I think what can happen is, and I don't have the right words, but it's not an absence of an ethic of care. I'm thinking of a meeting I had recently. I think the
Mm-hmm.
staff care about the young person,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but they themselves are stretched super thin. They're
Mm-hmm.
overwhelmed. They're
Yeah.
dysregulated.
Mm-hmm.
I think we were finally able to sort of frame this learner's experience in a way that they could sort of wrap their heads around a little bit and demonstrate that ethic of care because I hadn't really seen it yet. But their solution was you need to get your learner into mental health support outside of the school setting. This is a mental health issue. This isn't a school issue, right? Where it's like the care gets you to a certain point, but there was so much dysregulation and overwhelm happening at the table of like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just a teacher. I can't take this on. I'm just a whatever. I don't even know if our school psychologist can take this on. And then they really didn't like when I was like, well, part of the IEP is to also support staff. And if you are not feeling prepared to meet this young person and don't feel like you have the tools, those can be embedded into the IEP to get you the support that you need as well. And then the administrative person was like, okay, well, they gotta go. Like, but I think that there's a level of dysregulation that I understand the adults experiencing, right? I understand that they're stretched super thin. I understand when a learner situation is complicated and you don't fully understand it. And as you start to understand it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is bigger than I can hold right now because I'm overwhelmed. And I can make space for your humanity and I can make space for your reaction, but it doesn't stop there. There's an and we need to push through that with curiosity and ground what we're doing in the humanity of the learner and make sure that we're not being dismissive and saying, here's the hot potato, go find outside services. I mean, we could keep talking forever about this because the mental health world in terms of being able to access it both within the school and outside of the school is very, very difficult. I mean, full disclosure, I've been on a waiting list for a therapist for like 6 months. I'm like, 1-800, do you have an opening yet? Like, mama's dying on the vine. Like, where are you?
Oh gosh. No.
Destiny is my, uh, what do I want to say? My pro bono therapist.
And as
She
is
doesn't know
is my pro bono therapist.
it.
And for anyone that is listening to this, ethically, I am not her therapist.
No, no,
I'm an
I'm
actual
joking. She's not
therapist.
my therapist.
But no, I think
I
that
wish, but
that was
she's
a
not.
good
She's not
way
in the
to
right
like
state.
head towards, the wrap up of just that again. the purpose of this episode was to really shine a light on the psychological impact that educational settings can have while acknowledging that it's hard, right? It's hard.
Yeah.
The system, again, is not set up for your mental health. It's just not. But I've come across so many educators that do feel lighter and do feel less strain on their own mental health because of accommodations that they have implemented and practices they've implemented in their classrooms. And, that's the whole, really, if you want to look at it without even thinking about that, is the whole reason why we do this podcast, is because we want to say there's a different way to do from what you've been doing, and that professionally we have been there in different roles, and personally we have been there in different roles, and we're trying to collectively speak on those different sides. And so I hope that you got, honestly, a more human, right, insight into the impact that certain practices can have, but also understanding the importance of connection and regulation and safety, and starting to challenge some of the ways in which things are presented that are not only harmful for the learner, but harmful for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have 2 more episodes left for our first season of the Affirming Village podcast. If you have been with us from the beginning, thank you. If you're new, welcome. We are not everybody's cup of tea, but we don't care. So
I was like, maybe we're their glass of wine.
But we have 2 more episodes left, and so we're really going to have to think about how we want to wrap it up, because we wrapped up part 1 so beautifully. Now we have to think of how we want to wrap the season up, but thank you for being here and listening and learning.
Yeah, we appreciate you.
Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.